Dylan Cross wasn't a man you'd expect to see on a grand stage, much less in the Galactic Games. He stood no taller than 5'6", with arms as thin as reeds and a face permanently set to apologize. The man had lived his entire life being passed over. And that's why, when the selection for Earth's competitor in the Strongmen Gauntlet was announced, even Dylan was sure they'd made a mistake. Dylan Cross, you have been chosen to represent humanity in the 137th Annual Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet. Dylan blinked at the hologram hovering in his living room. His dog, Bruno, seemed just as confused, tilting his head in that way dogs do when something inexplicable happens. No, there's got to be some error. Dylan rubbed his forehead, scrolling through the official government site. He checked the credentials, and there it was, his name in all caps, officially listed as Earth's competitor. They've got to be joking. But the bureaucratic machine of the Galactic Federation was rarely mistaken when it came to such high-profile events. The Strongmen Gauntlet was one of the galaxy's most anticipated spectacles, a grueling contest where the strongest of every species competed in events designed to break bones, crush spirits, and prove supremacy. And now, Dylan, a man who struggled to lift grocery bags without wheezing, was going to be Earth's champion. 2 days later, after a whirlwind of media attention and a government-issued ticket to the stars, Dylan found himself aboard a sleek shuttle, drifting towards the arena on Xinoa 5, a planet known for its sprawling intergalactic stadiums. "Welcome to Xinoa 5, Earthling," the attendant, a green-skinned Vakrian, said as Dylan stepped off the shuttle. He nodded stiffly, gripping the handle of his suitcase with both hands. Around him, competitors from every corner of the galaxy filed in. Hulking figures that towered above him, their skin tough and gleaming under the artificial lights. He'd never felt so small. The Arena of Champions was the most intimidating structure Dylan had ever seen. Massive columns rose into the sky, each etched with the victories of past champions. He walked through the grand entryway, overwhelmed by the alien architecture and the sheer size of everything. As Dylan made his way through the competitors' halls, the stares began. Beings twice, 3 times his size turned to gape at him. Most tried to hide their smirks. A few didn't even bother. "Is this some kind of joke?" one of the towering Growthers growled, his 6 limbs flexing as he leered down at Dylan. The creature's biceps were the size of Dylan's torso. Dylan swallowed hard, but managed to muster a shaky, "No joke." The Growther huffed in amusement and turned to his companions, who erupted into deep-throated laughs. Dylan forced himself to keep walking, but it was hard to ignore the pit forming in his stomach. This wasn't just out of his league, he wasn't even on the same planet as these guys. Once inside his assigned quarters, Dylan collapsed onto the bed. "What the hell am I doing here?" he muttered to himself, staring at the ceiling. He had no clue how he was supposed to survive, let alone compete. The first day of the competition dawned, and Dylan was summoned to the briefing room along with the other competitors. A towering Zalfrin stood at the front, his gravity-dense body seeming to suck the air out of the room. His voice was deep, vibrating through the metal walls as he explained the rules. This year's gauntlet will consist of 5 trials, each designed to test the full extent of your strength. The first trial, the Pillars of Burden. Dylan leaned in, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had to at least know what he was facing. The Pillars of Burden will require each competitor to hold up a collapsing structure for as long as possible. Failure to do so will result in immediate disqualification. Dylan's stomach dropped. Hold up a collapsing structure. That sounded like the worst possible scenario for someone who could barely bench press 50 pounds. He glanced around at the competitors, all of whom looked confident, muscles bulging in anticipation. Dylan felt like a twig in a forest of oaks. "May the strongest survive," the Zalfrin concluded, and the room emptied. As Dylan stood at the starting line for the first trial, the reality of his situation hit him like a freight train. The other competitors were already preparing, their muscles rippling as they stretched and warmed up. He glanced at the massive pillars in front of them, each one looking like it weighed as much as a small building. "What am I supposed to do here?" Dylan muttered to himself. A booming voice echoed through the stadium, announcing the start of the trial. The ground trembled as the massive stone pillars began to crack and tilt, their weight pressing down on the competitors. Dylan watched as the others rushed to position themselves under the structures, their legs bracing and muscles straining to keep the pillars from collapsing. Dylan, on the other hand, stood frozen. There was no way he could lift something like that. His mind raced. He could try to hold it, but he'd be crushed in seconds. There had to be another way. Think, Dylan. Think. Suddenly, an idea sparked. It wasn't about holding the pillar up, it was about stopping it from falling in the first place. As the others strained under the weight, Dylan scanned the ground, noticing small cracks forming at the base of his assigned pillar. He knelt down and quickly jammed his foot into one of the cracks, wedging a nearby rock into place. The pressure from the pillar seemed to stabilize. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it bought him time. Dylan scrambled around, using bits of debris and stones to reinforce the weak points around the base. Sweat dripped down his face as he worked, but he wasn't lifting anything. Instead, he was propping, balancing, creating a makeshift brace for the structure. Minutes passed, and to his astonishment, the pillar stayed up. He couldn't believe it. Around him, competitors were beginning to falter, the weight becoming too much even for their superhuman strength. One by one, they dropped out, their pillars crashing to the ground with thunderous booms. But Dylan's pillar, still standing. The final horn blared, signaling the end of the trial. Dylan stood there, panting, his hands dirty and scraped, but his pillar still miraculously upright. He looked around, disbelief etched on his face, as he realized he'd made it through the first trial. A deep voice called out over the arena's intercom. "Dylan Cross advances to the next round." The crowd erupted in laughter, cheers, and a few bewildered murmurs. But all Dylan cared about was that he wasn't disqualified. As he walked back to his quarters, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Maybe he'd... The Weakest Champion Part 2. The second round came faster than Dylan would have liked. The moment he stepped out of his quarters, the sneers and laughter from the other competitors began again. The fact that he had survived the first round was a fluke in their eyes. They figured the pillars of burden had been easy for him because he'd used his brain when the contest was about brawn. Dylan wished that was true. When he arrived at the competitors' staging area, the screen flashed up the details of the next trial. Trial 2, the Vault of Pressure. It was as ominous as it sounded. From what Dylan could gather from the briefing, each contestant would be placed inside a massive, sealed vault where the gravity would gradually increase. The winner would be the one who could last the longest before giving in to the pressure quite literally. For most of the competitors, who had trained their entire lives in high-gravity environments or who had bodies built to endure extreme conditions, this was their bread and butter. Dylan, meanwhile, struggled under Earth's gravity on a good day. He sucked in a breath as the competitors were ushered to the vault chambers. Each contestant had their own vault, and the tension in the air was palpable. The Zalfran judge from the first trial was there again, his presence like a black hole of authority. His deep voice echoed through the arena. "You will enter your vaults now. The gravity will begin at 1g and increase by 1 factor every minute. The first competitor to submit will be disqualified. The last one standing will advance." Dylan's palms were already sweaty as he stepped into the small, metallic chamber. The door sealed behind him with a heavy thud, and suddenly he was alone. A single light overhead flickered, and a panel on the wall showed the current gravity level, 1g. It started out easy enough. Earth's standard gravity was something Dylan could manage without much effort. He tried to focus, blocking out the rising panic in his mind. He knew that every minute that passed would make things harder, heavier. His breathing was calm for now, but he could feel the weight of expectation on his shoulders. The first few minutes went by without much change. The competitors outside the arena were already boasting about how long they could withstand the gravity. Some claimed they could last hours before feeling the effects. Dylan knew that wasn't in the cards for him. By 3G, Dylan could feel it. His knees wobbled a bit, and he had to brace himself against the wall to keep from falling over. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. He wiped sweat from his brow, feeling the rising tension in his legs. It was still manageable, but not for long. Meanwhile, in the other chambers, the stronger competitors were just getting warmed up. The Growlers and the Korthon, in particular, seemed to thrive under the pressure. Dylan could almost imagine them smirking as they withstood the increasing weight without even breaking a sweat. He was out of his league. 5G. That's when the real struggle began. Dylan's body screamed in protest as the weight became crushing. His vision blurred slightly, and each breath was an effort. He could feel his legs trembling under the immense pressure, the bones in his spine aching. His thoughts raced as he desperately tried to think of a way out. The other competitors had endurance, strength, biology, and augmentation. But Dylan? Dylan had his mind. He had to rely on it now more than ever. He looked around the small chamber, scanning every surface for something, anything, that could help him. The gravity was artificial, controlled by the panel on the wall. He couldn't hack into it, but maybe he didn't need to. Then he noticed it, the seams in the walls. Small, but present. The chamber wasn't perfectly sealed. It was meant to withstand pressure, yes, but also to allow air circulation. It wasn't designed for someone like Dylan, who couldn't just rely on brute strength to survive. The idea came to him in a flash. Dylan lowered himself to the ground slowly, trying to ease the strain on his legs. The pain was almost unbearable now, but he forced himself to breathe through it. He reached for the seams, using his fingers to pry them apart just slightly. He wasn't sure if this would work, but he had no choice. The gravity continued to increase. 7G. Dylan could barely move now, his muscles screaming, but he focused all his energy on creating a tiny gap in the wall. With trembling fingers, he wedged a piece of his suit into the seam. It wasn't much, but it might just relieve a fraction of the pressure. The seconds dragged on. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but he knew the other competitors had to be feeling the strain by now. They were stronger than him, but they weren't invincible. They would tire eventually. 10G. Dylan's vision tunneled. His limbs were leaden, his entire body feeling like it was being crushed by a freight train. He could barely keep his eyes open. But the small gap in the wall seemed to do something. It wasn't perfect, but it took just enough of the edge off for him to stay conscious. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed through the chamber, an alert. One of the other competitors had collapsed under the pressure. Dylan didn't know who, but it meant someone had cracked. He forced himself to hang on. The gravity was relentless, but so was his determination. His breathing was shallow, his mind barely holding on. He had no idea how long he had left, but he knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Then, mercifully, the gravity stopped increasing. Dylan blinked, dazed and disoriented. The pressure was still unbearable, but it had stopped growing. The screen in front of him flashed. Max gravity reached. 10G. He had made it. The trial was over. The doors of the vault opened with a hiss, and Dylan stumbled out, barely able to stand. He could see the other competitors emerging from their chambers, most looking battered, but some still standing strong. A few had been disqualified, collapsed in their chambers, unable to withstand the crushing weight. But Dylan was still there. He had survived. The Zalfrin judge's voice boomed over the arena. Dylan Cross advances to the next round. Once again, the arena erupted with laughter, confusion, and disbelief. The weakest human had somehow made it through 2 rounds. And now, they were starting to wonder if Dylan was hiding something more than just his lack of physical strength. As Dylan limped back to his quarters, a new sense of resolve settled in him. He wasn't just surviving, he was adapting. And as the trials continued, he'd need every ounce of his wit, creativity, and determination to keep going. Because the challenges ahead were only going to get harder. Dylan slumped into his quarters, his entire body aching. Every muscle, every joint screamed in protest, and his mind was still reeling from the gravity trial. But despite the overwhelming exhaustion, he had made it through again. and that was more than most of the competitors could say. He hadn't expected to survive this far, and it seemed like neither had anyone else. As Dylan glanced out the window, he could see some of the other competitors returning from their vaults. The Growthers walked with an air of triumph, while the Vakrians moved with their usual silent grace. But one thing was clear: several were missing. Some of the strongest races had fallen, unable to withstand the pressure of the vault of pressure. Dylan's mere survival was nothing short of a miracle. As he sat down on the edge of his bed, the door to his quarters slid open, and a massive figure stepped inside. Dylan jumped, his heart racing until he recognized the familiar outline of one of his competitors, Jorak the Korthan. Jorak was a strange sight, even for an alien. His massive frame was heavily augmented with cybernetic enhancements, making him look more machine than flesh. His arms, thick as tree trunks, were encased in metal, while his eyes glowed faintly with the telltale light of optical implants. He had been one of the few competitors who hadn't laughed at Dylan yet. "Earthling," Jorak said, his voice deep and mechanical. "You are an anomaly." Dylan tensed, unsure if this was a threat or a compliment. Thanks." Jorak stepped further into the room, his heavy footsteps causing the floor to vibrate. He examined Dylan with curiosity, his glowing eyes narrowing as if analyzing every inch of the human. "You should not have made it this far," he said flatly. "By all metrics, you are the weakest competitor, physically speaking." Dylan wasn't sure whether to feel insulted or agree. "Yeah, well, I guess I have other strengths." Jorak tilted his head slightly, the metal plates on his neck shifting with a soft whir. "Your ability to survive the trials is intriguing. The pillars of burden, you did not lift, you stabilized. The vault of pressure, you found a way to redistribute the force." He crossed his arms, the servos in his cybernetics hissing softly. "You think like an engineer." Dylan blinked. "I think like a guy who doesn't want to get crushed." The Korthun's eyes flickered, the closest thing to a laugh Dylan had ever seen from him. "Survival is not the same as victory. The next trial will test your resolve." Dylan frowned. "You know what the next trial is?" Jorak paused for a moment, his gaze distant as if accessing some unseen database. "The next trial is the Ladders of Fire, a test of endurance and balance. You will have to ascend a series of platforms suspended over a burning pit. The platforms will shift and collapse, and only those with the strength and speed to climb will succeed." Dylan's heart sank. "Great. Sounds like I'm going to fall into a pit of fire." Jorak's mechanical face remained unreadable. "I am curious to see if you will." Without another word, Jorak turned and left, leaving Dylan alone with his thoughts. The Ladders of Fire sounded like something out of a nightmare, and when Dylan arrived at the arena the next day, it looked even worse. Suspended over a glowing pit of molten lava were a series of floating platforms. Each one seemed to sway and tilt in the air, and they were connected by narrow ladders that stretched between them. The heat from the lava was intense, even from where Dylan stood at the starting line. The other competitors gathered around, each one preparing for the trial. Dylan glanced nervously at the others, most of whom looked perfectly at ease. The Vakrians, with their long limbs and agility, seemed especially suited for this trial. The Growthers were less graceful, but their raw power would likely make up for it. And then there was Jorak, standing silently, his augmented body already calculating the best route. Dylan swallowed hard, his palms sweating despite the heat. This was bad. He wasn't agile, he wasn't strong, and he certainly wasn't fast. But he couldn't afford to lose now. Not after surviving this long. The Zalfran judge stepped forward, his booming voice echoing across the arena. "The third trial, Ladders of Fire. You must reach the top of the final platform to succeed. The platforms will shift, and the ladders may collapse. Those who fall will not advance." Dylan's stomach turned at the thought of falling into the lava below. He tried to focus, taking deep breaths as the countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The horn blared, and the competitors surged forward. Dylan moved cautiously, watching as the others leaped onto the first platform with ease. He hesitated for a moment, then jumped. His legs buckled slightly as he landed on the swaying platform, but he managed to stay upright. Ahead of him, the Vakrians were already halfway up the ladders, moving with incredible speed and precision. The Growlers, meanwhile, used their massive strength to pull themselves up by sheer force. Jorak climbed steadily, his cybernetic limbs gripping the ladders with mechanical precision. Dylan, on the other hand, struggled. The platforms wobbled dangerously beneath him, and the heat from the lava made it hard to concentrate. His hands were slick with sweat as he reached for the first ladder, his heart pounding in his chest. As he climbed, the platform beneath him suddenly shifted, tilting at an extreme angle. Dylan's grip slipped, and he nearly lost his footing. Panic surged through him as he dangled from the ladder, his legs kicking wildly in the air. "Focus, Dylan," he muttered to himself, forcing his hands to tighten around the rungs. He pulled himself up with every ounce of strength he had, gritting his teeth as he climbed higher. But the platforms weren't the only problem. The ladders themselves were designed to collapse without warning. As Dylan reached the top of the second platform, the ladder ahead of him suddenly gave way, the metal rungs crumbling into the lava below. Dylan froze. There was no way to cross. The other competitors had already moved on, leaping from platform to platform with ease. Dylan could see Jorak ahead, his augmented limbs allowing him to make massive jumps with mechanical precision. But Dylan was stuck. He looked around, searching for another way forward. There was nothing, no handholds, no alternate route. His only option was to leap to the next platform, but it was too far. He'd never make it. Or would he? Dylan's eyes narrowed as he crouched down, calculating the distance. He had one shot. If he didn't make the jump, he'd fall into the lava and be out of the competition for good. With a deep breath, Dylan took a running start and leaped into the air. For a split second, he was weightless, soaring through the air as the lava bubbled below him. Time seemed to slow as he stretched his arms out, reaching for the edge of the platform. His fingers brushed the edge, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he'd miss. But at the last second, his hand caught the ledge, and he clung to it with everything he had. His muscles screamed in protest as he hauled himself up, collapsing onto the platform with a gasp of relief. He'd made it, barely. But there was no time to rest. The final platform loomed ahead, and Dylan knew he couldn't afford any more mistakes. He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking as he grabbed onto the last ladder. The heat was unbearable now, the air thick with smoke and ash. But Dylan pushed forward, his determination stronger than ever. He could see the finish line. He was so close. As he reached the top of the final platform, the horn blared, signaling the end of the trial. Dylan collapsed onto the metal surface, gasping for breath. He had done it. He had survived the ladders of fire. Once again, the Zalfrin judge's voice echoed across the arena. Dylan Cross advances to the next round. Dylan couldn't believe it. Against all odds, he had made it through 3 trials, and now only 2 remained. But as he looked around at the remaining competitors, he knew the worst was yet to come. The thrill of survival after the ladders of fire faded quickly once Dylan saw how few competitors were left. The remaining alien champions stood around the staging area, hardened expressions on their faces as they waited for the next trial. There were only 6 competitors now, whittled down from the original dozens who had arrived on Xinoa 5 for the Strongmen Gauntlet. Dylan caught sight of Jorak, the Korthon, who was tinkering with one of his cybernetic limbs. He looked up, meeting Dylan's gaze with a slight nod, as if acknowledging the human's improbable progress. The Vakrians stood near the edge of the room, their eyes darting between the screens displaying the statistics of each contestant. Meanwhile, the Growlers loomed near the center, their heavy bodies barely contained by their massive frames. Dylan tried to shake off the weight of their stares. He was still the smallest, still the weakest, but he had come this far. He wasn't ready to quit now. The massive screen flickered as the Zalfrin judge appeared once again, his voice booming through the chamber. Competitors, you have proven your strength, your endurance, and your balance. Now, the time has come to test your resilience and strategy. Dylan's stomach twisted. Every trial so far had nearly crushed him, and now he was about to face another one designed specifically to test the mind as much as the body. The fourth trial, the judge continued, is the maze of beasts. The other competitors exchanged glances, some with grim determination, others with quiet confidence. Dylan, however, could feel his heart racing. The maze of beasts is a living labyrinth, the judge explained. It will constantly shift and change. Within its walls dwell creatures from across the galaxy, each one more dangerous than the last. Your goal: reach the center and retrieve the crystal of victory. Only the first 3 to exit the maze will advance to the final round. Dylan's heart sank even further. He wasn't just competing against the maze or the creatures inside, it was a race against the others. And this time, there would be no waiting for the weakest to survive. The clock was ticking. You will be released into the maze at different entry points, the judge continued. Prepare yourselves. Dylan took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how he was going to survive this. The last thing he needed was a maze full of alien predators, but he knew there was no backing out now. His chances of making it to the final round were slim, but if he was going to have any hope at all, he had to think faster, smarter, and sharper than the others. He looked up at the screen, which now displayed a live feed of the maze. It was a sprawling labyrinth of shifting walls, dark corridors, and towering hedges. Strange, shadowy figures moved through its depths, and the sound of growls and howls echoed through the speakers. As Dylan was escorted to his entry point, he couldn't help but feel a pit of dread forming in his gut. This was it. The maze of beasts. He might not make it out alive. The starting gates closed behind him with a metallic thud, sealing him inside the first chamber of the maze. The walls stretched high above him, and the path ahead was narrow and winding. The distant roars of the creatures lurking in the shadows filled the air, making it clear that this maze was far more than just a puzzle. Dylan glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The maze was already shifting, the walls creaking and moving, creating new pathways while sealing others. He couldn't afford to stand still for long. He had to move, and quickly. He dashed forward, taking the first turn that opened in front of him. His footsteps echoed against the stone walls as he made his way deeper into the maze, his heart pounding in his chest. The first creature he encountered was something out of a nightmare. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with scales that shimmered like polished steel. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and it let out a low growl as it spotted him. Dylan froze. There was no way he could fight this thing head-on. He barely had time to react before the beast lunged at him, its jaws snapping just inches from his face. Thinking quickly, Dylan dove to the side, rolling out of the creature's path. His body screamed in protest, still aching from the previous trials, but he forced himself to keep moving. The creature charged again, and this time Dylan spotted a narrow passageway off to the side. He sprinted toward it, barely slipping through the gap before the beast could close the distance. The creature snarled in frustration, but the passage was too narrow for it to follow. Dylan could hear it pacing behind him, its growls fading as he moved deeper into the maze. Breathing hard, Dylan leaned against the wall for a moment, trying to steady himself. That had been too close. He couldn't keep running like this. He needed a plan. As he navigated the winding corridors, Dylan kept one ear tuned to the shifting walls and the other to the sounds of the creatures stalking the maze. He knew that the others would be facing their own dangers, but that didn't mean they weren't already ahead of him. He needed to use his environment to his advantage, just like he had in the previous trials. After what felt like hours of dodging beasts and backtracking through shifting passages, Dylan found a small alcove where he could catch his breath. His legs were burning from all the running, and his head was spinning from the constant changes in the maze layout. But as he rested, his mind began to work. The maze was alive. It was shifting, yes, but it wasn't random. There was a pattern. Dylan had seen its small, subtle changes in the movement of the walls, the way certain paths opened and closed. If he could figure out the pattern, he could navigate the maze more effectively. Taking a deep breath, Dylan waited, watching the walls around him carefully. It didn't take long for him to spot the next shift, a slow, deliberate movement of the stone walls, closing off one path and opening another. He grinned. He had it. With renewed determination, Dylan moved quickly, using his newfound understanding of the maze's behavior to guide his steps. He avoided dead ends, outmaneuvered the creatures lurking in the shadows, and followed the pattern as it led him deeper into the labyrinth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dylan caught sight of the center of the maze, the Crystal of Victory, glowing brightly on a pedestal in the middle of a small clearing. His heart leaped in his chest. But he wasn't alone. Jorak stood at the edge of the clearing, his cybernetic limbs gleaming in the dim light. He turned as Dylan approached, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You're too late, Earthling," Jorak said, his voice calm but cold. "This victory is mine." Dylan glanced at the crystal, then back at Jorak. He wasn't sure how he was going to get past the Korthon, but he couldn't just give up. He took a step forward, his mind racing. "You're right, Jorak. You're stronger than me. Faster, too. But this isn't just about strength, is it?" Jorak's gaze flickered with curiosity. "What are you implying?" "This whole maze, it's a puzzle," Dylan said, taking another step closer. "You can't just smash your way through it. You have to think, adapt. That's what I've been doing this whole time. It's why I'm still here." Jorak tilted his head, his glowing eyes scanning Dylan's face. For a moment, neither of them moved. The crystal's soft glow pulsed between them, and the air was thick with tension. Then, without warning, the maze shifted again. The ground beneath Jorak's feet trembled, and before he could react, the floor opened up beneath him. He stumbled, his cybernetic limbs whirring as he tried to regain his balance, but it was too late. He fell into the pit below, disappearing from sight. Dylan stood frozen, his heart pounding. He couldn't believe it. He had won. With shaking hands, he approached the pedestal and reached for the crystal. The moment his fingers touched its cool surface, the entire maze seemed to freeze, the walls halting their constant shifts. A loud horn blared across the arena, signaling the end of the trial. Dylan Cross advances to the final round. Dylan couldn't help the small grin that tugged at his lips. He had made it. Against all odds, he was one of the final three. But as he made his way back to the entrance, he knew the hardest challenge was yet to come. Dylan sat alone in his quarters, staring at the small crystal that marked his victory in the maze of beasts. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, and his mind was struggling to process what had just happened. He had made it to the final round of the Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet. The weakest man on Earth had outlasted dozens of competitors from across the galaxy. But now, with only 3 contestants remaining, the next trial would be the ultimate test. The victory felt hollow. Jorak, his most formidable rival, had fallen not because of Dylan's strength or skill, but because of the maze's shifting nature. Part of him knew it wasn't a fair win, but another part reminded him that this entire competition had been rigged against him from the start. He wasn't supposed to be here, yet somehow he was. A knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. He stood up, his muscles still sore from the trials, and opened the door to find an attendant waiting for him. She handed him a tablet, her expression neutral. "The final trial will commence in 2 hours. You are to report to the preparation chamber at once." Dylan nodded, accepting the tablet and watching as the attendant turned and left. He glanced down at the screen, reading the details of the final challenge. Trial 5, the Gauntlet of Titans. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. The description that followed was no less terrifying. The Gauntlet of Titans is a brutal endurance course designed to test the strength, resilience, and determination of the strongest beings in the galaxy. Competitors will face a series of physical and mental challenges, each more demanding than the last. The first to reach the end will claim victory. The others will fall. Dylan's stomach churned as he read the specifics of the trial. The course would include massive obstacles, walls of solid stone, pits filled with deadly creatures, and, worst of all, a final stretch called the Bridge of Titans, where the last competitors would have to physically push against a crushing force to cross the finish line. He wasn't strong enough for this, not by a long shot. Yet, somehow, he had survived everything else. His mind raced with thoughts of how he could approach the trial, how he might outthink his opponents rather than outfight them. But this was the final round. There wouldn't be any shortcuts this time. He was facing the galaxy's strongest competitors, and they wouldn't hold back. The door to his quarters slid open again, and Dylan was led to the preparation chamber. The other two finalists were already there, standing tall and imposing. One was a growler named Krax, a beast of a competitor, with muscles layered on top of muscles and 6 powerful limbs that twitched with anticipation. The other was a Vakrian named Tallis, whose lithe frame and sharp, predatory eyes gave her an air of deadly confidence. They had both dominated the competition so far, and Dylan felt utterly outclassed in their presence. Krax shot him a disdainful look as Dylan entered. "You've survived this long, human. But this trial will break you. It will crush you." Dylan swallowed hard but said nothing. He knew better than to rise to the bait. Tallis, on the other hand, didn't even bother acknowledging him. She simply stared at the course displayed on the screen, her mind likely already calculating her every move. The Zalfran judge appeared once again, his voice a low rumble as he addressed the finalists. "Competitors, you have proven yourselves to be the strongest in this gauntlet, but only one of you will emerge as the champion. Prepare yourselves." A heavy silence fell over the room as the competitors were escorted to the starting line of the gauntlet. Dylan's heart pounded in his chest as he looked out over the course. The obstacles were massive titanic walls of stone, platforms suspended over deep chasms, and the final bridge of titans looming in the distance like a grim monument to power. 3, 2, 1. The horn blared, and they were off. Krax and Tallis immediately surged ahead, their powerful limbs propelling them forward with ease. Dylan was left behind in their dust, but he didn't panic. He had expected this. Speed wasn't his strength, and trying to keep up with them now would only exhaust him before the real challenge began. The first obstacle was a massive wall, its surface slick with some kind of alien slime. Krax reached it first, using all 6 of his limbs to scale the wall in a matter of seconds. Tallis followed, her agility and grace allowing her to leap from handhold to handhold with almost no effort. Dylan, on the other hand, struggled. His arms burned as he tried to find a grip on the slimy surface, his fingers slipping again and again. He couldn't rely on brute strength like Krax, nor could he move with the precision of Tallis. But there had to be another way. He scanned the wall, his eyes landing on a small crack near the base. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. He wedged his foot into the crack, using it as leverage to push himself up. Slowly, carefully, he began to ascend, using every small crevice and handhold he could find. It was slow going, but it worked. By the time he reached the top, Krax and Tallis were already halfway through the next obstacle. Dylan pressed on, his legs shaking as he jumped down from the wall and sprinted toward the next challenge. It was a series of platforms suspended over a pit filled with strange, writhing creatures that snapped their jaws hungrily at anything that moved. Krax leaped from platform to platform with ease, his massive bulk barely disturbing the swaying structures. Tallis, meanwhile, moved like a shadow, her footsteps light and quick as she danced across the platforms without even glancing at the creatures below. Dylan hesitated for a moment, eyeing the platforms warily. One wrong step and he'd be done for. But he couldn't afford to be slow now. He took a deep breath and leaped onto the first platform, his knees wobbling as it swayed under his weight. The creatures below hissed and snapped, their razor-sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. Dylan forced himself to focus, carefully hopping from platform to platform. He wasn't fast, but he was deliberate. He took his time, watching how the platforms moved, waiting for the perfect moment to jump. It took longer than he would have liked, but eventually he reached the other side. By now, Krax and Thales were already nearing the final stretch of the gauntlet, the Bridge of Titans. Dylan's heart sank as he saw the last obstacle. The bridge was a narrow walkway suspended over a bottomless pit, and at the far end, a massive stone gate blocked the finish line. The only way to open it was to push a massive slab of stone across the bridge, a task that would require incredible strength. Krax was already there, his 6 limbs straining as he shoved the slab forward. The bridge creaked under the weight, but Krax didn't falter. He pushed with raw, animalistic power, inching closer to victory. Thales was close behind, using her agility to navigate the bridge with ease. She was smaller, but faster, and she knew how to conserve her energy for the final push. Dylan, meanwhile, was exhausted. His muscles burned, his lungs ached, and he could barely think straight. But he had come too far to give up now. He stepped onto the bridge, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. Krax was almost at the finish line, the slab nearly pushed to the end of the bridge. Dylan watched as the Growther grunted and growled, his massive frame trembling with effort. But then, something strange happened. The bridge beneath Krax began to buckle. The weight of the slab was too much, and the supports were starting to crack. Krax froze for a moment, his eyes widening in realization. He had pushed too hard, too fast, and now the bridge was collapsing under him. Dylan saw his chance. While Krax was distracted, Dylan rushed forward, his mind racing. He couldn't push the slab the way the others did, but maybe he didn't have to. Instead of focusing on brute strength, he looked for a different approach. The slab was held in place by a series of mechanical locks, designed to prevent any shortcuts. But Dylan had learned to look beyond the obvious. He crouched down, examining the base of the slab, and noticed a small gap between the gears. With trembling hands, he reached into his belt and pulled out a small tool he had brought with him, something he had been saving for a moment like this. He jammed it into the gap and twisted. The gears clicked. The slab, instead of requiring a massive push, slid smoothly across the bridge. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Dylan pushed with all his remaining strength, feeling the weight shift just enough to inch the slab forward. And then, with a final, desperate shove, the slab clicked into place. The stone gate at the end of the bridge rumbled open, revealing the finish line. Dylan collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. He had done it. The horn blared once again. Dylan Cross is the champion of the Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet. The crowd erupted into cheers, disbelief, and awe. Against all odds, the weakest human had triumphed over the galaxy's strongest. As Dylan lay there, staring up at the sky, he couldn't help but laugh. He had won. Dylan couldn't move. His body was leaden, every muscle aching as though they'd been torn apart and stitched back together. But none of that mattered. He had done it. The announcement still echoed in his mind, a surreal moment that didn't feel real yet. Dylan Cross is the champion of the Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet. It seemed like something from a dream or a nightmare, considering the trials he'd been through to get there. For a long while, Dylan lay on the bridge, too exhausted to stand. The crowd's cheers rang in his ears, a chaotic mix of excitement and confusion. Most of them couldn't understand how it had happened, and Dylan was still struggling to believe it himself. Eventually, the medics arrived. A pair of attendants, Vakrians with slender builds and cool efficiency, lifted him onto a stretcher. He winced as they secured him and started wheeling him off the course. Around him, screens in the arena replayed highlights from the final trial. Krax, the massive Growther, snarling as the bridge beneath him collapsed, and Dylan's final, desperate push of the slab. The whole galaxy was watching. In the distance, he could see Krax still standing at the edge of the crumbled bridge, his 6 limbs flexing in barely concealed rage. He had come so close, only to lose to a human half his size. Dylan didn't envy the look of pure frustration on the Growther's face, but he understood it. As they wheeled him toward the medbay, Dylan's thoughts drifted to Jorak. He hadn't seen the Korthon since the Maze of Beasts, and part of him felt guilty about how that trial had ended. But this was a competition, and there had only ever been room for one winner. The rules were clear, and Dylan had done what he needed to do to survive. Once in the medbay, Dylan was hit with a wave of relief as they placed him in a regenerative pod, its cool liquid slowly seeping over his bruised and battered body. The pain dulled to a manageable throb, and for the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe. The medics left him alone to rest, and Dylan closed his eyes, trying to process everything that had happened. He had entered this competition as the weakest human, a nobody who didn't even belong on the same stage as these alien titans. And yet, here he was the champion. It was absurd. The door to the medbay hissed open, and Dylan opened his eyes, expecting another attendant. Instead, he was surprised to see a familiar face, Jorak. The Korthon stepped inside, his glowing eyes scanning the room before settling on Dylan. His cybernetic limbs moved with quiet precision, but there was no hostility in his posture. If anything, he looked curious. "You've won," Jorak said simply, his voice low and mechanical. Dylan nodded slowly. "Yeah, somehow." Jorak approached the edge of the pod, his metallic frame casting a shadow over Dylan. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Dylan wondered if Jorak had come to confront him about the maze of beasts, about how he had been outmaneuvered. But the Korthon's next words caught Dylan off guard. "You were never the strongest," Jorak said. "Not by physical standards. But you proved something in this gauntlet. You adapted. You endured." Dylan wasn't sure how to respond. "I just didn't want to get crushed." Jorak's glowing eyes flickered slightly, almost like a smile. "That is what makes your victory more impressive. You faced challenges designed for beings far stronger than yourself, and yet you prevailed. Strength is not always about muscle or force. You have shown that." Dylan blinked, not entirely sure if he was being complimented or analyzed like a specimen. "Thanks, I guess." Jorak tilted his head, his expression unreadable behind the metal plating that covered half his face. "You survived where many would not have. The galaxy will remember this victory, and it will challenge the perceptions of those who believe strength is only about power." Dylan hadn't thought about it like that. He had been so focused on just making it through each trial that he hadn't considered what his victory might mean on a larger scale. The Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet had always been a showcase of brute force, a contest to see who was the strongest of the strong. But his win? It was something different. "I'm not exactly your typical champion," Dylan muttered, still trying to wrap his head around it. "No," Jorak said, his voice thoughtful. "You are not." The Korthon straightened, his mechanical limbs clicking softly as he turned to leave. Before he stepped out of the room, he paused and looked back at Dylan. "Do not underestimate the impact of what you have achieved here, Earthling. The galaxy may value strength, but you have shown that strength comes in many forms." With that, Jorak left, the door hissing shut behind him. Dylan let out a long breath, staring up at the ceiling of the medbay. He hadn't expected any of this. Not the trials, not the victory, and certainly not the respect he was now getting from someone like Jorak. But there was truth in what the Korthon had said. Dylan's win wasn't just a fluke, it was proof that humanity's strength lay in more than just physical power. As he lay there, reflecting on everything that had happened, a soft chime sounded from the console next to him. A message appeared on the screen, bearing the official seal of the Galactic Federation. "Congratulations, Dylan Cross. You have been awarded the title of Galactic Champion. Your victory will be celebrated across the Federation, and you will be granted an audience with the High Council to receive your prize." Dylan stared at the message in disbelief. An audience with the High Council? A prize? He hadn't even thought about what would happen after winning. He had been so focused on surviving that he'd forgotten about the actual rewards. The next day, after his body had recovered enough to move without collapsing, Dylan was escorted to the Grand Chamber where the High Council resided. It was a massive hall, filled with representatives from dozens of different species, all of them watching him with a mix of curiosity and respect. The council members, each one an imposing figure in their own right, sat on raised platforms, looking down at Dylan as he approached. The head of the council, A regal-looking Zalfrin with deep purple skin and glowing eyes stood to address him. "Dylan Cross of Earth," the council leader said, his voice reverberating through the hall. "You have achieved what many believe to be impossible. You have won the Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet, not through brute strength, but through determination, creativity, and resilience. Your victory is a testament to the potential of your species." Dylan stood awkwardly in the center of the hall, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," he mumbled, feeling completely out of his depth. The council leader raised a hand, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "As the champion, you will be granted a substantial reward. But more than that, your victory has earned you and your people a place of honor within the Galactic Federation." Dylan blinked. "A place of honor?" The Zalfrin smiled a small, barely perceptible curve of the lips. "Yes, your triumph in this gauntlet has shown the galaxy that strength is not solely measured by physical might. Your victory will change how the Federation views not only Earth, but all species who might be underestimated." Dylan didn't know how to respond to that. He had come here expecting to lose. Now he was not only the champion, but he had somehow managed to elevate humanity's standing in the galaxy. As the ceremony continued, Dylan couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He hadn't just won the gauntlet, he had proven something to the galaxy. Humanity, the species known for its adaptability, had earned its place among the stars. And as Dylan looked around at the gathered representatives, he realized something else. This was only the beginning. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Dylan walked out of the grand chamber, the weight of his new title pressing down on him harder than any of the gauntlet's trials. Galactic Champion. The sound of it didn't feel real, and yet the proof was there. The recognition from the High Council, the murmurs of awe from alien dignitaries, and the strange stares from beings who, just days ago, would have laughed him off as a joke. He made his way back to his quarters, a little dazed from the ceremony. As much as he wanted to rest, the flood of messages and requests had already begun. Various governments from across the galaxy were sending him congratulatory notes, offers of trade, and invitations to speak at grand events. Earth itself was likely preparing a hero's welcome for him, assuming they could get over the shock that he had actually won. Still, none of it felt real yet. He had been an afterthought, a nobody sent to represent Earth by mistake. And now, he had reshaped humanity's place in the galaxy. He wasn't sure how to process it all. The door to his quarters slid open with a soft hiss, and Dylan found himself staring at another unexpected guest. Krax, the hulking Growther, stood in the middle of the room, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the walls. The sight of the alien's 6 limbs flexing with suppressed rage set Dylan's nerves on edge. It didn't take a genius to figure out why Krax had come. Dylan stayed by the door, ready to call for security if things got ugly. "Krax," he said cautiously, "what can I do for you?" The Growther's eyes burned with anger, his massive fist clenching and unclenching as he stared down at Dylan. For a long moment, the alien didn't say anything, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled breaths. "You should not have won," Krax growled, his voice low and menacing. "You were weak. You still are." Dylan tensed, keeping his distance. He didn't want to provoke Krax, but he wasn't going to let himself be intimidated either. "You're right," Dylan said carefully. "I'm not the strongest. I'm not the fastest. But I won. I used what I had." Krax's eyes narrowed, his fist tightening. "You won because of tricks. You survived because the gauntlet allowed it. But this was a contest of strength, and you are not strong." Dylan swallowed hard, but he didn't back down. Strength isn't just about muscle, it's about surviving, enduring, thinking on your feet. I did what I had to do to survive, just like you would have. Krax took a step forward, his massive frame looming over Dylan. "The galaxy will forget your name. They will remember me. Krax, the strongest of the Growthers. You will be nothing." Dylan's heart raced. He could feel the raw power radiating from Krax, but he also knew that the Growther's words were rooted in his own frustration. Krax had been inches away from winning. He had been on the verge of claiming victory, only to be undone by his own brute force. Dylan's victory had exposed a fundamental flaw in the Growther's approach, a truth that Krax couldn't accept. Before things could escalate, the door slid open once more. A towering figure stepped inside, Jorak, the Korthon. His cybernetic eyes flickered as he scanned the room, quickly assessing the situation. The tension in the air was thick, and Jorak's presence only heightened it. "Krax," Jorak said, his voice calm but firm. "Leave." Krax's eyes blazed with fury as he turned toward the Korthon. "This is none of your concern, Jorak." "It is," Jorak said, stepping closer. "The gauntlet is over. You were defeated. Accept it." The room was silent for a moment, the air electric with a threat of violence. Dylan stood frozen, watching the exchange between the two alien titans, uncertain of what would happen next. For a moment, it seemed like Krax would attack, his muscles tensing, his fist clenched tight. But then, with a deep, guttural growl, he turned and stormed out of the room, his massive form vanishing down the hallway. The door closed behind him, leaving Dylan and Jorak alone. Dylan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thanks for that," he muttered, still trying to calm his racing heart. Jorak nodded, his glowing eyes fixed on the door where Krax had just left. "He will not accept his defeat easily," the Korthon said. "Growthers rarely do." Dylan slumped into a nearby chair, his muscles still aching from the trials. "He's right, though. I'm not the strongest." "No," Jorak said, his voice level. "But you were the smartest, and that, in this gauntlet, was enough." Dylan chuckled softly. "Guess so." Jorak moved closer, his mechanical limbs making only the faintest of sounds as he walked. "I did not come here only to intervene with Krax," he said. "There is something I wish to discuss with you." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Jorak's glowing eyes studied him for a long moment. "You have proven something in this gauntlet, something that goes beyond mere physical strength. You have shown that human ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability can surpass even the most powerful of species." Dylan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know if I'd go that far." "I would," Jorak said firmly, "and others will as well. Your victory has drawn attention. The High Council sees potential in you and in your species." Dylan frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What are you saying?" Jorak leaned in slightly, his metallic frame casting a long shadow over Dylan. "The Galactic Federation values strength, yes, but strength comes in many forms. Your kind has shown a new kind of strength, one that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy." Dylan blinked. "You're talking about Earth, aren't you?" Jorak nodded. "Earth has been seen as a minor player in the Federation for a long time. But your victory here changes that. The High Council is already discussing how humanity might be integrated into the larger galactic stage." Dylan's mind raced. He had come to the gauntlet expecting nothing more than a humiliating loss. Now, not only had he won, but his actions had drawn the attention of the most powerful entities in the galaxy. Earth's future was suddenly tied to his victory in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'm just one guy," Dylan said, shaking his head. "I didn't win this for Earth. I barely won for myself." Jorak's glowing eyes narrowed. "And yet, your actions have consequences beyond yourself. The galaxy is watching. What you do next will shape how humanity is perceived." Dylan slumped back in his chair, feeling the weight of Jorak's words. He had never asked for this responsibility, but now it was his, and he had to figure out what to do with it. Before Jorak could continue, the tablet in Dylan's hand chimed, interrupting the moment. A message from the High Council flashed across the screen. "Dylan Cross, champion of the Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet, you are hereby invited to the Grand Summit of Worlds. Your presence is requested to discuss the future of Earth's role in the Galactic Federation." Dylan stared at the message, his heart racing. The Grand Summit was a gathering of the most powerful leaders in the galaxy, a place where alliances were formed, and wars could be started with a single word. and now they were asking him to represent Earth. Dylan looked up at Jorak, a mixture of fear and uncertainty in his eyes. "What do I do?" Jorak's mechanical face was unreadable, but there was something like respect in his voice when he replied. "You do what you have always done, Dylan Cross. You survive. You adapt, and you prove them wrong." Dylan nodded slowly, the weight of the galaxy's eyes now resting squarely on his shoulders. He had survived the gauntlet. Now he had to survive the galaxy. Dylan stood before the massive docking bay of the Galactic Federation's flagship, Eclipse of Stars. The ship was a leviathan, easily the size of a small city, its sleek, metallic hull shimmering under the artificial lights of the spaceport. As he gazed up at it, the enormity of his next challenge sank in. The Grand Summit of Worlds wasn't just a diplomatic meeting. It was a gathering of the most powerful political and military leaders from across the galaxy. Each one had their own agendas, their own alliances, and now, for the first time, Earth would have a voice among them. And that voice was his. "I'm just an engineer," Dylan muttered to himself as he approached the boarding ramp. "What am I doing here?" As he walked up the ramp, two Vakrian guards nodded respectfully, a stark contrast to the sneers and smirks he'd been met with when he first arrived for the gauntlet. Everything had changed since his victory. He was no longer seen as the weakest human. He was the Galactic Champion, and with that title came expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. Inside the ship, the grandeur of the Federation's wealth and power was on full display. The hallways were lined with polished metal, and the soft hum of advanced technology filled the air. Dylan was led to a private chamber where he was to prepare for his introduction to the summit. As he sat alone in the quiet room, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Feeling out of place, Dylan?" Dylan turned to see Jorak standing in the doorway, his mechanical limbs gleaming under the soft lights. The Korthon's glowing eyes regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and something close to amusement. "You could say that," Dylan replied, rubbing the back of his neck. "This whole thing feels like a mistake. I'm not a politician. Jorak, I don't know how to negotiate with alien leaders." Jorak stepped into the room, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. "The summit is not about negotiation," he said. "It is about power. You may not realize it, but your victory in the gauntlet has given you more influence than any politician could dream of." Dylan frowned. "Influence? Over what?" Dylan sank into a nearby chair, the weight of Jorak's words pressing down on him. "What if I can't deliver? What if I'm just a fluke?" Jorak's mechanical face remained expressionless, but his voice was firm. "You have already proven yourself, Dylan. Now, you must show the galaxy that your kind is worth more than a single victory. The leaders here will try to undermine you, to test your resolve. But you are no longer just a competitor. You represent your entire species." The gravity of that statement hit Dylan hard. His palms grew sweaty as he considered what was at stake. It wasn't just about him anymore. Earth's future in the galaxy now rested on his shoulders. Before he could say anything else, the door to the chamber slid open, and a sleek, silver-skinned alien stepped inside. Dylan recognized the species, Zarthians, known for their sharp intelligence and cold, calculating nature. This one wore the uniform of a Federation diplomat. "Champion Dylan Cross," the Zarthian said, his voice smooth and measured. "The Grand Summit is about to begin. The Council is waiting for you." Dylan swallowed hard and nodded. He glanced at Jorak, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. With a deep breath, Dylan stood and followed the Zarthian diplomat out of the chamber. The hallway leading to the summit's grand chamber was long and imposing, flanked by towering columns and lined with holographic displays of past champions and historical moments in galactic history. Dylan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His moment was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. As they reached the massive double doors that led to the chamber, the Zarthian paused and turned to Dylan. "A word of advice, champion," the diplomat said, his silver eyes gleaming. "The leaders inside will see you as a curiosity, a symbol of humanity's unexpected rise. They will try to use you for their own purposes. Do not be fooled by their flattery." Dylan nodded slowly. "I'll keep that in mind." With a soft hum, the doors slid open, revealing the grand chamber beyond. It was a vast, circular room, filled with representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Some of them sat on elevated platforms, their eyes fixed on the entrance. Others stood in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. At the center of the room was a massive holographic display of the galaxy, its stars and planets twinkling in the dim light. The moment Dylan stepped inside, all eyes turned toward him. The murmurs stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The leaders of the galaxy were watching him, measuring him. At the far end of the chamber, the High Council sat on a raised platform. The council leader, the regal Zalfrin who had awarded Dylan his title, stood and gestured for him to approach. "Champion Dylan Cross," the council leader said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You have earned your place here through strength, ingenuity, and determination. Today, you stand before the galaxy as a representative of Earth, a species many have underestimated. Now, we ask, what role will humanity play in the future of the Galactic Federation?" Dylan hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. What role would humanity play? He had no idea. Earth was still a relatively minor player in the galactic scheme, its technology far behind that of the more advanced species. And yet, his victory had forced the galaxy to reconsider what humans were capable of. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Earth has always been adaptable," Dylan said, his voice steady but unsure of how it would be received. "We've survived because we learn, we change, and we push ourselves beyond what others think we can do. We might not be the strongest or the most advanced, but we've always found a way." He paused, glancing around the room at the various leaders who watched him with keen interest. "In the gauntlet," Dylan continued, "I wasn't the strongest, but I found a way to win. And that's what humans do. We find a way. We've proven that we belong here, that we can stand with the galaxy's strongest." The chamber remained silent, the leaders still studying him, waiting to see where he was going with this. "We may not have the technology or the military power of some of the other species," Dylan said, his voice growing more confident. "But we have something else, the ability to innovate, to think creatively, and to adapt to any situation. And that's what we bring to the table. We bring the unexpected." There were murmurs in the crowd now, a ripple of conversation that spread across the chamber. Dylan could see the flicker of interest in the eyes of some of the leaders, while others remained skeptical. The council leader raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. He studied Dylan for a long moment, his glowing eyes unreadable. "Humanity's potential is indeed intriguing," the council leader said. "But potential alone is not enough. The galaxy is a dangerous place, full of challenges and threats that require more than adaptability. It requires strength, unity, and the willingness to make hard choices. Is your species prepared for such a role?" Dylan's mind raced. He knew the council leader was testing him, pushing him to see how far he was willing to go. "We're prepared," Dylan said, his voice steady. "We've always faced challenges head-on. And now that we're part of the Federation, we'll do whatever it takes to prove that we belong." The council leader's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Dylan thought he saw a hint of approval. "Very well, Champion Dylan Cross. We will watch your species closely." Dylan exhaled, feeling a rush of relief. The hardest part was over at least, for now. As the meeting concluded and the leaders began to disperse, Jorak approached him, his mechanical eyes glowing softly. "You handled yourself well," Jorak said. "But this is only the beginning. The galaxy will not accept Earth's rise without resistance." "I figured as much," Dylan muttered, rubbing his temples. "What do I do now?" Jorak's eyes gleamed. "Now, you learn to play the game." The following days were a blur of meetings, handshakes, and introductions to alien diplomats. Dylan had been thrust into the galactic political scene, and while he had survived the gauntlet, this new challenge felt even more daunting. The leaders of the Galactic Federation were not warriors but tacticians, each with their own agendas and alliances. Earth's sudden rise in prominence, thanks to his unexpected victory, had made Dylan a person of interest and a target. "Stay alert," Jorak had advised after one particularly tense meeting. "Many of these species will smile to your face while plotting how to undermine you behind closed doors." Dylan quickly learned that Jorak was right. The compliments and congratulations he received felt thin, as if everyone was sizing him up, waiting for him to make a mistake. Some leaders saw Earth's entry into the Federation as a threat to their own power, while others viewed humanity as a curiosity, something to be manipulated or exploited. Still, despite the pressures, Dylan knew he had to stay focused. His role wasn't just about representing Earth. He was forging the path for his entire species in the galaxy, and that path was fraught with unseen dangers. It was during one such diplomatic event, a grand reception on the eclipse of stars, that the first hint of those dangers began to reveal themselves. The reception was an extravagant affair. Alien dignitaries from across the galaxy mingled in the massive ballroom, sipping exotic drinks and exchanging pleasantries in dozens of different languages. The walls were adorned with holographic displays of alien art, and soft music filled the air, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and wealth. Dylan moved through the crowd, trying to stay composed despite the weight of his new responsibilities. He exchanged brief words with various diplomats, many of whom were eager to congratulate him on his victory, while subtly probing him for information about Earth's political standing. As he navigated the room, he caught sight of a small group of delegates standing near the back, away from the central gathering. They were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward Dylan as they spoke. Something about their posture set off alarm bells in his mind. One of the delegates, a tall and imposing figure with sharp features and dark, swirling tattoos on his skin, stepped forward and approached Dylan. He carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and the smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. "Champion Dylan Cross," the delegate said, his voice smooth and honeyed. "A pleasure to finally meet the human who surprised the galaxy." Dylan nodded, forcing a polite smile. "And you are?" "I am Vrexall," the delegate replied, "representative of the Thraxian Dominion." Dylan's smile faltered slightly. He had heard of the Thraxians. They were a powerful and aggressive race, known for their expansionist ambitions and their ruthless military conquests. Their empire spanned dozens of systems, and they were not the type to take kindly to anything that upset the balance of power. "I've heard of the Thraxian Dominion," Dylan said cautiously. "I didn't expect to meet one of your representatives here." Vrexall's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, the Dominion is always interested in matters of strength and power, and your victory in the gauntlet has drawn our attention." Dylan could feel the weight of Vrexall's gaze, and he knew there was more to this conversation than simple pleasantries. "What can I do for you, Vrexall?" Dylan asked, keeping his tone neutral. The Thraxian's eyes gleamed. "It's simple, champion. Your victory has elevated your species in the eyes of the Federation. But strength must be tested. Power must be earned." Dylan's stomach twisted. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. "Are you challenging me?" Vrexall chuckled softly. "Not directly, no. But the Thraxian Dominion has long held the belief that true strength is measured not just in physical trials, but in the willingness to seize power when it is within reach. You have the attention of the Federation now, but do you have the resolve to take what is rightfully yours?" Dylan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Vrexall leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Federation is weak, fractured. The different factions squabble over resources, territory, and influence. But you could tip the balance. With the right allies, you could carve out a place for your species at the top of the galactic order." Dylan felt a chill run down his spine. The Thraxian was offering him a path to power, but it came with a price. "I'm not interested in playing those kinds of games," Dylan said firmly. "I didn't come here to start a war or overthrow the Federation." Vrexal's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You misunderstand, human. War is inevitable. Whether you like it or not, the balance of power is shifting. And if you're not prepared to take your place, others will, by force, if necessary." Dylan's heart pounded in his chest. This was no idle threat. The Thraxian Dominion was notorious for its aggressive tactics, and Vrexal's words were a clear warning. "I'll take my chances with the Federation," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Vrexal studied him for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "Very well, champion. But remember this, strength is not just about survival, it's about domination, and those who fail to dominate are destined to be dominated themselves." With that, Vrexal turned and walked away, leaving Dylan standing alone in the crowded room, his mind racing. The Thraxians weren't just a threat to Earth, they were a threat to the entire Federation, and now they had set their sights on him. Later that night, after the reception had ended and the guests had retired to their quarters, Dylan sat in his room, staring out at the stars beyond the viewport. Vrexal's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the precarious position he was in. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door slid open, and Jorak entered, his mechanical limbs moving with quiet precision. The Korthon regarded Dylan with his usual unreadable expression, but there was a hint of concern in his glowing eyes. "You look troubled," Jorak said, stepping into the room. Dylan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I had an interesting conversation with a Thraxian today. Vrexal. He made it clear that the Dominion sees Earth as a potential ally or a potential enemy." Jorak's eyes narrowed slightly. "The Thraxians are always seeking to expand their influence. They view power as something to be taken by force, and they respect only those who are willing to do the same." "I'm not looking for a fight," Dylan muttered, "but it sounds like they are." Jorak nodded. "They are, and you must be careful, Dylan. The Federation is a delicate balance of power. If the Thraxians push too hard, it could lead to open conflict. And if that happens, Earth will be caught in the middle." Dylan leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What do I do? I'm not a soldier. I'm not a diplomat. I'm just trying to keep Earth safe." Jorak stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "You are more than you realize, Dylan. You have already proven that you can think strategically, that you can adapt to impossible situations. This is no different. The Thraxians want to intimidate you, to make you feel like you have no choice but to align with them. But you have choices, and you have allies." Dylan looked up at Jorak, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Allies?" "The Vakrians, the Korthon, and many others in the Federation respect strength, yes, but they also respect integrity. If you stand your ground, if you show them that Earth is not a pawn to be used in their games, you will find allies among them." Dylan took a deep breath, letting Jorak's words sink in. He hadn't asked for this responsibility, but now it was his to bear. The galaxy was watching, and how he navigated this delicate situation would determine not just his fate, but the fate of Earth. "I'll stand my ground," Dylan said, his voice filled with resolve. "But I'm going to need your help, Jorak." The Korthon nodded, his mechanical eyes gleaming. "You have it." The days following Dylan's encounter with Vrexal were tense. News of his conversation with the Thraxian spread through the diplomatic circles, though none knew the full details. Whispers filled the halls of the Eclipse of Stars, speculating about Earth's future and its newfound position in the galactic balance of power. Some saw Earth as a potential ally, others as a threat, and behind the scenes, everyone seemed to be positioning themselves for what might come next. Dylan spent hours in meetings, navigating this new world of galactic politics with Jorak by his side. Jorak had become his closest ally, offering advice and helping him understand the nuances of the different factions. Dylan was grateful for the Corthon's presence, but the pressure was mounting. He could feel the weight of the decisions he had to make pressing down on him. One night, after another grueling session with Federation diplomats, Dylan returned to his quarters, exhausted. His mind was spinning with thoughts of Rexall's words, the delicate balance of the Federation, and the future of Earth. He poured himself a drink and sank into a chair, staring out at the stars beyond the viewport. He barely had time to relax before his tablet chimed, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message. Sighing, Dylan reached for the tablet and checked the screen. Urgent. Meet in conference room 7. There was no sender, no further details, just the message. Dylan's brow furrowed. This wasn't standard procedure. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something about the urgency in the message made him uneasy. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and left his quarters, heading toward the conference rooms. As he made his way through the dimly lit halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The ship was unusually quiet, with only a few crew members passing by, their faces tense and hurried. The tension in the air was palpable. When Dylan reached conference room 7, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit space. Seated at the long table were 3 figures, each one familiar, and none of them particularly friendly. Rexall sat at the far end of the table, his sharp, tattooed features gleaming in the low light. To his right was Tallis, the Vacrian finalist from the Gauntlet, her predatory gaze fixed on Dylan as he entered. And to his left was Krax, the massive Growther who had nearly won the Gauntlet before Dylan's victory on the collapsing bridge. Dylan stopped just inside the door, his heart racing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice steady but wary. Rexall leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "An opportunity, champion," he said, his voice smooth and calculating. "For all of us." Dylan's eyes darted between the 3 aliens, each one watching him with intense interest. This wasn't a diplomatic meeting, it was something far more dangerous. Krax was the first to speak, his deep voice rumbling through the room. "You're not the strongest, human, but you're clever, and you've proven you can survive when others fall." He leaned forward, his 6 limbs resting heavily on the table. "That's why you're here." Dylan narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Tallis smirked, her sharp eyes gleaming. "The Federation is weak, Dylan. You've seen it yourself. The factions are divided, squabbling over scraps while real power goes untapped. But we," she gestured to herself, "Krax and Rexall, we see an opportunity." Rexall picked up where Tallis left off. "Your victory in the Gauntlet has given you influence, champion. Influence you could use to shape the future of the galaxy. Join us, and together, we can reshape the Federation into something stronger, more unified." Dylan's stomach twisted. "You're talking about a coup." Rexall's smile was thin. "Call it what you like. The Federation is already crumbling under its own weight. We are simply accelerating the process, clearing the path for those who truly understand strength." Krax's eyes burned with intensity. "You have the chance to stand with us, Dylan, to rise above the petty politics of the Federation and claim a place of real power." Dylan's heart raced as he processed their words. This was far worse than he had expected. Rexall and the others weren't just seeking alliances, they were planning to overthrow the very foundation of the Federation, and they wanted him to join them. "I'm not interested in your power plays," Dylan said, his voice cold. "I didn't come here to overthrow the galaxy. I came to represent Earth." Tallis scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Earth? Earth is a backwater planet, barely relevant on the galactic stage. Your people don't understand the stakes. But you do, don't you?" Dylan clenched his fists, trying to keep his temper in check. "I know enough to see that you're playing a dangerous game, and I'm not going to be a part of it." Krax's muscles tensed, his massive frame looming over the table. "You don't have a choice, human. The Federation is collapsing, whether you like it or not. You can stand with us and survive or be swept away with the rest of them." Dylan's mind raced. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and dangerously close to being pulled into something far bigger than he had anticipated. But he couldn't back down. He had fought too hard, survived too many trials, to let these three manipulate him into betraying everything he had worked for. Vrexol's voice dropped to a low, threatening whisper. "Think carefully, Dylan. The Thraxian Dominion does not make offers lightly. This is your chance to secure Earth's future. If you refuse, you will regret it." Dylan's pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced at each of them in turn: Krax's simmering rage, Tali's calculating gaze, and Vrexol's cold ambition. They were offering him power, influence, a seat at the table of galactic rulers. But it wasn't the kind of power Dylan wanted. "I'm not going to help you tear the galaxy apart," Dylan said, his voice firm. "If you want a war, you'll have to fight it without me." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, Vrexol's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of pure menace. "So be it, champion. But know this, when the time comes, Earth will fall, and you will be the one responsible." Dylan stood his ground, his heart racing but his resolve unshaken. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could feel their eyes on his back, but he didn't look back. He knew he had made the right decision, but he also knew that he had just made some very dangerous enemies. Back in his quarters, Dylan paced the floor, his mind racing. Vrexol, Krax, and Tali's were planning something big, something that could plunge the entire galaxy into chaos, and they had wanted him to be a part of it. The weight of the situation was crushing. He had refused them, but what now? How could he protect Earth from a threat that was already in motion? The door to his quarters slid open, and Jorak stepped inside. The Korthun's glowing eyes immediately locked onto Dylan, reading the tension in his posture. "What happened?" Jorak asked, his voice low and concerned. Dylan sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. "They're planning a coup," he said, his voice shaky. "Vrexol, Krax, and Tali's, they want to take over the Federation, and they wanted me to help them." Jorak's expression darkened. "You refused?" "Of course I did," Dylan replied, frustration and fear mixing in his voice. "But now they see Earth as an enemy. They're going to come for us, Jorak." The Korthun was silent for a moment, his mechanical limbs humming softly as he considered the situation. "You did the right thing," he said finally. "But you're right, this isn't over. The Thraxians and their allies won't back down easily. They will move quickly, and when they do, the Federation will be caught off guard." Dylan leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "What do we do?" Jorak stepped closer, his glowing eyes narrowing with determination. "We fight back. We gather allies, those who believe in the Federation, who see the value in unity rather than conquest. There are still many who will stand with you, Dylan. But we must act quickly." Dylan nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't a politician, but he knew how to survive. He had proven that in the Gauntlet, and now he had to prove it again on an even larger stage. The galaxy was on the brink of war, and Dylan Cross, the weakest human, was at the center of it. Dylan's heart raced as he stood in the command center of the eclipse of stars. The weight of what was coming, the confrontation with Vrexol and his allies, the imminent threat to the Federation, and the danger looming over Earth pressed down on him like a crushing force. He had no idea how things had escalated so quickly, but now he was in the center of it all, trying to hold everything together. The Grand Summit of Worlds had descended into chaos after Dylan's refusal to join Vrexol's coup. The Thraxians, Krax's Growthers, and several other factions sympathetic to their cause had begun mobilizing, ready to take advantage of the Federation's weakened state. Whispers of civil war filled the halls of the Federation's capital, and panic was beginning to spread. "We don't have much time," Jorak said, standing beside Dylan as they overlooked the situation from the command room's tactical display. "The Thraxians will make their move soon, and when they do, they'll hit hard. They won't just come for Earth, they'll target key Federation worlds and try to fracture any chance of unity. Dylan nodded, feeling the immense weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't a strategist, but he had learned enough from the Gauntlet to know that hesitation would be deadly. What's our next move? We gather allies, Jorak said, his mechanical eyes scanning the room. The Federation may be divided, but there are still strong factions who don't want to see it torn apart. The Korthun, the Vakrians, and even some of the Growthers who don't support Krax's ambitions. We can form a coalition, a defensive force to stand against Vrexal and his dominion. Dylan looked out at the vast starscape beyond the viewport, trying to steady his mind. A part of him still couldn't believe that this was happening. That he, a random human who had been mistakenly sent to a contest of strength, was now trying to rally the galaxy to prevent a civil war. Let's do it, Dylan said, his voice firm. We can't let them tear the galaxy apart. The next few days were a whirlwind of diplomatic talks, tense negotiations, and urgent preparations. Dylan and Jorak worked tirelessly to gather support from the various factions of the Federation. It wasn't easy. Many of the alien leaders were hesitant to openly oppose the Thraxians, fearing retaliation or political fallout. But Dylan's status as the Galactic Champion gave him leverage, and with Jorak's guidance, they managed to form a loose coalition of factions willing to stand against Vrexal's coup. The Vakrians were the first to pledge their support. Talis, despite her initial rivalry with Dylan, had seen the threat Vrexal posed and agreed to join the coalition. The Korthun, led by Jorak's influence, also rallied behind Dylan, their cybernetic warriors prepared for battle. Even a few of the Growthers, who had grown disillusioned with Krax's brutal tactics, secretly offered their support. But the coalition was fragile, and time was running out. Every moment they delayed gave Vrexal more time to prepare his forces. Dylan knew that once the Thraxians struck, the galaxy would be plunged into chaos. It was on the eve of their first major strategic meeting that the final blow came. Dylan stood in the war room, surrounded by holographic displays showing the state of the galaxy. Representatives from the various factions were seated around the table, discussing battle plans and defense strategies. The air was thick with tension, everyone acutely aware that the fate of the Federation hung in the balance. Then, without warning, an alarm blared through the ship. Alert! Incoming transmission from the Thraxian Dominion. Dylan's heart pounded as the holographic display shifted, revealing Vrexal's face. The Thraxian's dark tattoos seemed to pulse with menace, his sharp features twisted into a predatory smile. "Champion Dylan Cross," Vrexal said, his voice dripping with mockery. "How noble of you, rallying these weaklings to stand against us. But it's too late." "What do you want, Vrexal?" Dylan asked, his voice tense. "I want you to understand," Vrexal said, his eyes narrowing. "This was inevitable. The Federation is dying, and we will take its place. Your coalition will crumble, and Earth, your precious Earth, will fall with it." Dylan's jaw clenched. "We're not afraid of you, Vrexal. We'll stand against you." Vrexal chuckled softly. "Brave words, champion. But you won't have the chance." The transmission cut off abruptly, and the room plunged into silence. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then, the ship's tactical officer turned toward Dylan, her face pale with shock. "Sir, we're detecting a massive fleet entering the system. Thraxian warships, hundreds of them." Dylan's blood ran cold. Vrexal had moved faster than they had anticipated. The coup was already underway. "We have to act now," Jorak said, his voice calm but urgent. "The Thraxians are here. If we don't stop them, they'll destroy everything." Dylan nodded, his mind racing. He wasn't a military leader, but he knew they couldn't afford to hesitate. This was it, the moment everything would be decided. "Get the fleet ready," Dylan ordered. "Prepare our forces. We're not going down without a fight." The battle that followed was unlike anything Dylan had ever imagined. The skies above the capital world of Xinoa 5 were filled with the roar of engines and the bright flashes of energy weapons as the Thraxian fleet clashed with the hastily assembled coalition forces. Ships of all sizes darted through the chaos, weaving between enemy fire and launching counterattacks. Dylan watched from the bridge of the Eclipse of Stars, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen battle simulations before, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scale of this conflict. The Thraxians were relentless, their warships pressing forward with brutal efficiency. Jorak stood beside him, his mechanical limbs tense as he watched the battle unfold. "We're holding them off for now, but it won't last. The Thraxians outnumber us, and they've already disabled several of our key ships." Dylan gripped the edge of the console, his mind racing. "We need to hit their command ship. If we take out Vrexal's flagship, it could disrupt their entire fleet." Jorak nodded. "Agreed. But their command ship is heavily guarded. We'll need a direct strike to have any chance." Dylan turned to the tactical officer. "Ready a strike team. I'll lead the mission myself." Jorak raised an eyebrow. "You're going down there?" Dylan nodded. "I have to. Vrexal made this personal. If we don't stop him now, Earth is finished." Without further hesitation, Dylan and Jorak boarded a small strike vessel, along with a team of elite Korthan soldiers. The plan was simple but dangerous: infiltrate Vrexal's flagship, disable its command systems, and force the Thraxians to retreat. As the strike vessel sped toward the Thraxian command ship, weaving through the chaos of battle, Dylan's mind raced. He had survived the gauntlet, faced trials that had pushed him to his limits, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. The fate of Earth, and possibly the entire Federation, rested on his shoulders. The strike vessel pierced through the defensive shields of Vrexal's flagship, and within moments, Dylan and the strike team stormed aboard. The corridors were a blur of gunfire and flashing lights as they fought their way toward the command center. Jorak led the charge, his cybernetic limbs cutting through Thraxian soldiers with terrifying precision. Dylan stayed close behind, his heart pounding as they pushed deeper into the ship. The air was thick with tension, every corner a potential ambush. Finally, they reached the command center. Vrexal stood at the center of the room, his predatory smile fading as he saw Dylan and Jorak enter. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension palpable. "You've lost, Vrexal," Dylan said, his voice steady. "It's over." Vrexal's eyes gleamed with defiance. "You think you can stop me, human? This is only the beginning." Without warning, Vrexal lunged at Dylan, his movements a blur of speed and fury. Dylan barely had time to react as the Thraxian's claws slashed toward him. But before Vrexal could strike, Jorak intercepted, his mechanical limbs clashing with Vrexal's in a blur of sparks and metal. The two titans fought with savage intensity, each blow shaking the room. Dylan watched, his heart racing, knowing that this was the final confrontation. With a final, devastating strike, Jorak's cybernetic arm smashed through Vrexal's defenses, sending the Thraxian sprawling across the floor. Vrexal lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Dylan stepped forward, standing over the defeated Thraxian. "You're finished," Dylan said quietly. Vrexal glared up at him, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't the end, champion. The Thraxians will never stop." Dylan's expression hardened. "We'll be ready." With Vrexal defeated and the command systems disabled, the Thraxian fleet began to retreat, their once dominant forces scattered in the wake of their leader's fall. The coalition had won the day, but Dylan knew this was only the beginning of a much larger struggle. As the Thraxian warships fled, leaving the skies above Xinoa 5 clear once more, Dylan stood on the bridge of the Eclipse of Stars, watching the stars beyond. He had survived another impossible challenge, but the galaxy was still a dangerous place, full of threats and uncertainties. Earth had proven its worth, but now it had to navigate the complexities of galactic politics, alliances, and conflicts. And Dylan, once the weakest human, had become its unlikely champion. "We did it," Jorak said, standing beside him. "But the galaxy will be watching us closely now. What happens next is up to you." Dylan nodded, feeling the weight of his new role. "Yeah," he said softly. "But whatever happens, we'll face it. Together." As the stars shimmered in the distance, Dylan knew one thing for sure. The galaxy had changed, and so had he. The aftermath of the Thraxian retreat brought a temporary sense of calm to the galaxy, but Dylan knew it was just that, temporary. The battle above Xinoa 5 had been a victory for the Coalition, but the deeper currents of galactic politics were still shifting. Vrexal's defeat had bought them time, but the Thraxians would regroup, and others would rise to challenge the newly formed alliance. Dylan stood on the balcony of the Eclipse of Stars, staring out at the vast expanse of space. The stars, so distant and cold, flickered like beacons of untold worlds, each one holding secrets, conflicts, and untapped potential. He had come a long way from the man who had been mistakenly sent to the Gauntlet, a man who had once doubted his ability to survive, let alone lead. Now, Earth had a seat at the table, but that seat came with a price. The galaxy had its eyes on humanity, and not all those eyes were friendly. The door behind him slid open with a quiet hiss. Dylan turned to see Jorak entering the room, his mechanical limbs moving with their usual quiet precision. The Korthon had become more than just an ally, he was a trusted friend, one who had helped guide Dylan through the challenges of the Gauntlet and the chaos that followed. "You're still awake," Jorak said, his voice a low hum of curiosity. "I thought you'd be resting." Dylan shook his head, turning back to the stars. "Too much on my mind." Jorak joined him at the balcony, his glowing eyes scanning the horizon. "It never gets easier, you know? The responsibility, the choices." "I'm starting to realize that," Dylan replied with a weary smile. "I thought surviving the Gauntlet was the hardest thing I'd ever do. But this leading Earth, navigating galactic politics, it's a whole different kind of challenge." Jorak was silent for a moment, then spoke with a rare softness. "You've done well, Dylan. Many would have crumbled under the pressure, but you've adapted, as your people always do." Dylan nodded, grateful for the words, but there was still a nagging question at the back of his mind, one that had been growing ever since the battle with the Thraxians. "What now?" Dylan asked, his voice quiet. "The Thraxians will come back. Vrexal made that clear, and Earth isn't ready for a full-scale galactic war. I don't know how we're going to protect it." Jorak studied him for a moment, his mechanical gaze unreadable. "You're right. The Thraxians are relentless. They will return, and when they do, they'll bring their full strength. But the coalition we've built isn't weak. The Vakrians, the Korthon, and others, we stand with you. Together, we can defend Earth and the Federation." Dylan appreciated the sentiment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The Thraxians weren't the only threat out there. The galaxy was filled with factions vying for power, and Earth was now a key player in that game. They needed more than just allies, they needed a way to protect themselves, to stand on equal footing with the more advanced civilizations. "There has to be something more," Dylan muttered, almost to himself. "Some way to give Earth an edge. We're not going to survive on luck and cleverness forever." Jorak's eyes gleamed softly in the dim light. "There is something," he said carefully, "something that could change everything." Dylan turned to face him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Jorak hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to continue. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "During the Gauntlet, you showed resilience, ingenuity, qualities that many of the advanced species overlook. But there is another way. A way to enhance those qualities through technology." Dylan frowned. "Technology, like your cybernetics?" Jorak nodded. "The Korthon have developed technologies far beyond what Earth currently possesses. With the right upgrades, you and your people could level the playing field. We've seen what humans are capable of with limited resources. Imagine what you could achieve with the power of advanced cybernetic augmentation." Dylan's mind raced. The idea was tempting. If Earth could harness Korthon technology, They could stand a chance against the Thoraxians and other threats. But at what cost? He had seen firsthand how Jorak and his people had become dependent on their cybernetic enhancements. Was that the future he wanted for humanity? I don't know, Dylan said, his voice uncertain. I've seen what those cybernetics can do, but I'm not sure Earth is ready for that. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Jorak nodded slowly. It's not a decision to be made lightly, but know this, the galaxy is evolving. The Federation is fragile, and the Thoraxians aren't the only ones who will challenge its stability. Earth will need to evolve as well, if it's going to survive in the long term. Dylan stared out at the stars, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Cybernetic enhancements could give Earth the edge it needed, but it also came with risks that could fundamentally change what it meant to be human. I'll think about it, Dylan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Jorak placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of camaraderie from the usually stoic Korthun. Whatever you decide, you won't be alone in this. You have allies, Dylan, and together we'll face whatever comes. Dylan nodded, feeling a surge of determination. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had come too far to back down now. Earth's future was at stake, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of diplomatic talks, strategic planning, and preparations for what was to come. Dylan and the coalition worked tirelessly to strengthen their defenses, knowing that Vrexal's forces would eventually return. Earth had begun to integrate more advanced technology into its military infrastructure, thanks to the assistance of Jorak and the Korthun, but the process was slow, and the looming threat of war hung over them all. One evening, as Dylan reviewed reports from the front lines, an encrypted message came through his personal terminal. It was marked with the seal of the Galactic Federation, a high-priority communication from the Council. Curious and wary, Dylan opened the message. To Champion Dylan Cross. From Galactic Federation High Council. Subject: Urgent Council Summit Invitation. Dylan Cross, Champion of Earth. In light of recent events and the growing instability within the Federation, you are hereby requested to attend an emergency summit at the Galactic Capital. The Federation faces a critical juncture, and your input is required as we navigate the challenges ahead. We await your response. Dylan stared at the message, his mind racing. An emergency summit. The Federation was on the brink, and now they were calling him in again. It wasn't just about Earth anymore. It was about the survival of the Federation itself. He sent a quick acknowledgement and leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The Federation was fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse, and once again, Dylan found himself thrust into the center of it all. But this time, he wasn't just a contestant in a competition. He wasn't just the underdog fighting to survive. He was Earth's champion, and the decisions he made now would shape the future of his people and the galaxy. As the ship set course for the Galactic Capital, Dylan stood at the viewport, watching the stars streak past. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers he couldn't yet see. But one thing was clear: the galaxy was changing, and so was he. And whatever came next, Dylan Cross would face it head-on. The summit chamber at the Galactic Capital was grander than Dylan could have imagined, even after the overwhelming experiences he had already faced in the Gauntlet and subsequent political chaos. The vast room was circular, the walls lined with banners of the hundreds of species that made up the Galactic Federation. Representatives from all corners of the galaxy filled the tiered seating, whispering to one another in dozens of alien languages, their eyes fixed on the central platform where Dylan now stood. He had been summoned not just as a witness to the chaos unraveling around the galaxy, but as an active participant in its future. The council leader, a regal Zalfrin with glowing violet eyes, stood on a raised dais, observing the crowd with a calm but intense gaze. Dylan could feel the weight of every single gaze in the room. This wasn't just another political meeting. This was the moment the Federation would decide its future, and, in many ways, its survival. The stakes were higher than ever before. We welcome Champion Dylan Cross, the victor of the Galactic Strongmen Gauntlet, The council leader's voice echoed throughout the chamber, amplified by hidden speakers embedded in the walls. His victory has shown us that strength is not only found in size or force, but in resilience, adaptability, and determination. And now, as our galaxy stands on the precipice of change, we seek his guidance as we chart the course ahead. Dylan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no formal political training, no background in diplomacy. Yet here he was, standing before the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He had survived impossible odds before, and now he had to do it again this time, with words. "Thank you, Council Leader," Dylan said, his voice surprisingly steady given the pressure he felt. "I'm honored to be here, but I'm not here because of my strength. I'm here because Earth has always been underestimated. And right now, Earth is a lot like the Federation. Small, underestimated, and seen by some as weak. But that's exactly why we're strong." There were murmurs throughout the chamber, some skeptical, others curious. "The galaxy is at a crossroads," Dylan continued, his confidence building. "The Thraxian Dominion and their allies want to tear this Federation apart. They see power only in brute strength and control. But that's not the real strength of this galaxy. The strength of the Federation is in its diversity, its ability to unite different species, different ideas, different perspectives. And that's something the Thraxians will never understand." More murmurs, but this time with a shift in tone. He could feel the crowd starting to sway, but there were still pockets of resistance. He caught the steely eyes of several prominent delegates, leaders of powerful factions who had always seen Earth as irrelevant. To them, Dylan was still just an anomaly, a fluke, an accident of the gauntlet. "But unity can't just be about words," Dylan said, turning to face the most powerful factions. "It has to be backed by action. We've already seen that Vrexall and his allies are willing to use force to get what they want. If the Federation doesn't respond, if we don't stand together and show that we're willing to defend what we've built, then we're going to fall apart." One of the delegates, a broad-shouldered reptilian leader from the Segral Consortium, stood. "You speak of unity, human. But what can Earth possibly offer in this fight? Your world is barely capable of defending itself, let alone holding off a galactic power like the Thraxians. Why should we rally behind you?" Dylan nodded, anticipating the challenge. "You're right. Earth doesn't have the most advanced technology. We don't have the biggest armies or the most powerful fleets. But that's exactly why we're valuable. We've learned how to survive with what we have. Earth's strength isn't in our weapons, it's in our ability to adapt, to find new ways of solving problems. The same way I won the gauntlet." The room was silent for a moment. Dylan could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He needed to go further, give them more than just words. He needed to give them a vision of a future where the Federation could survive, and Earth could play a vital role in that survival. "I know some of you think the Federation is already too fractured," Dylan said, his voice rising with conviction. "But it doesn't have to be. The Thraxians are a threat, yes, but they're not unbeatable. If we pool our resources, our knowledge, our technology, we can defend not just Earth, but every world in this Federation. And Earth can offer something unique." Dylan gestured toward Jorak, who had remained silent by his side throughout the speech. "The Korthon have shared some of their advanced technology with Earth. Together, we're developing new ways to defend our worlds, new ways to adapt to the challenges that are coming. But we need the rest of the Federation to stand with us. We need to stop thinking about what separates us and start thinking about how we can work together." There was a pause, the silence stretching on, thick with tension. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again, this time with more agreement than doubt. A voice from the far end of the chamber broke through the noise. "You ask us to rally behind Earth, behind you. But why should we believe that humans can stand against the Thraxians when even their own allies fear them?" The voice belonged to a Vakrian diplomat, a tall, elegant figure whose people were known for their pragmatism and neutrality. Dylan knew this was a crucial moment. He had to show them that Earth was not just a weak link, but a key piece of the puzzle. "I'm not asking you to believe in me," Dylan said, his voice steady. I'm asking you to believe in the Federation, in the idea that we're stronger together than apart. I didn't win the gauntlet because I was stronger than Cracks or faster than Tollies. I won because I used every advantage I had, every bit of knowledge I could gather, and I adapted. That's what we have to do now. We have to adapt. Together. The council leader raised a hand, silencing the room once more. His glowing violet eyes settled on Dylan, and for the first time, the hardened mask of neutrality slipped. There was a flicker of something respect, perhaps, or maybe hope. Your words are wise, champion, the council leader said. But words alone will not stop the Thraxians. The question before us is simple. Do we rally behind Earth and its coalition, or do we fracture, allowing the Dominion to pick us apart? Dylan's heart pounded as the council leader's gaze swept the room. This was the moment the fate of the Federation and Earth would be decided. For a long, agonizing minute, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the delegates began to rise. First, the Korthon, their cybernetic limbs gleaming in the low light. Then the Vakrians, their predatory eyes sharp with calculation. Even the Segral Consortium, who had been so skeptical moments before, stood in agreement. We stand with Earth, one of the Vakrian representatives said, for the good of the Federation. The words were like a spark, igniting a wave of support throughout the chamber. More and more factions pledged their allegiance, their voices rising in a chorus of unity. Dylan could hardly believe what was happening. He had come here unsure if anyone would listen to him, and now the Federation was rallying behind Earth's cause. As the last of the delegates stood, the council leader turned to Dylan, his eyes glowing with approval. It is decided, he said. The Federation will stand united against the Thraxian Dominion. Champion Dylan Cross, you have earned not only the title of Galactic Champion, but the respect of this council. Earth shall have our full support. A wave of relief washed over Dylan, but he knew this was only the beginning. They had won the first battle, the battle for unity, but the war was still looming on the horizon. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. The coalition's fleets were mobilized, defensive strategies were drawn up, and Earth was integrated into the Federation's military network. Jorak worked closely with Earth's leaders, sharing Korthon technology and training Earth's military forces in advanced combat techniques. Dylan, meanwhile, found himself thrust into the role of a wartime leader. He attended countless strategy meetings, negotiated with alien leaders, and did his best to prepare for the inevitable conflict with the Thraxians. It was exhausting, but he had never felt more driven in his life. The turning point came when the Thraxians made their move. A massive fleet of Thraxian warships emerged from hyperspace on the outskirts of the Federation's core territories. They wasted no time launching attacks on outlying colonies, testing the Federation's defenses. The coalition was ready, but the scale of the Thraxian assault was staggering. Their ships were powerful, their tactics brutal, and their determination unwavering. Dylan found himself aboard the command ship of the newly formed coalition fleet, watching as battle reports streamed in from across the galaxy. The war had begun. Vrexal's forces are targeting our outer defenses, Jorak reported, his mechanical limbs moving swiftly as he analyzed the battle data. They're trying to break through before we can fully mobilize. Dylan stared at the tactical display, his mind racing. The Thraxians were relentless, but he knew they weren't invincible. They had weaknesses he had to exploit. Send a strike team to their rear lines, Dylan ordered. We'll disrupt their supply routes and force them to overextend. Jorak nodded, already relaying the orders. It's a bold move, but it could work. The battle raged for hours, with both sides taking heavy losses. The Thraxians were fierce, but the coalition held its ground, refusing to give in. Earth's forces, bolstered by Korthon technology, played a crucial role in holding the line, their determination and adaptability proving invaluable in the face of overwhelming odds. As the tide of battle slowly began to turn in the coalition's favor, Dylan received an urgent transmission from one of the forward scouts. Sir, we've located Vrexal's flagship. He's leading the assault personally. Dylan's heart pounded. This was it. The opportunity they had been waiting for. "Prepare a strike team," Dylan ordered, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "We're going after Vrexall." The battle to reach Vrexall's flagship was intense. Dylan led the strike team himself, along with Jorak and a group of elite coalition soldiers. Their mission was simple: disable the flagship's command systems and force the Thraxians into retreat. But as they fought their way through the Thraxian defenses, Dylan realized that Vrexall wasn't just trying to win a battle, he was trying to send a message. The Thraxian leader had placed himself at the heart of the assault, daring the coalition to come for him. And Dylan was more than willing to take the bait. The strike team breached the hull of the Thraxian flagship, fighting their way through the narrow corridors as alarms blared and soldiers rushed to defend their leader. It was a brutal fight, but Dylan and his team pushed forward with unrelenting determination. Finally, they reached the command center. Vrexall stood at the center of the room, his dark tattoos glowing faintly in the low light. His sharp eyes fixed on Dylan as the human entered, a predatory smile curling his lips. "You came," Vrexall said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The champion of Earth, thinking he can stand against the might of the Thraxian dominion." Dylan didn't waste time with words. He raised his weapon, firing a burst of energy toward Vrexall. The Thraxian moved with blinding speed, dodging the attack and lunging toward Dylan with claws outstretched. But Dylan had faced worse before. He had survived the gauntlet, faced down beasts and alien titans, and emerged victorious. Vrexall was powerful, but Dylan had something the Thraxian lacked: adaptability. The two clashed in a whirlwind of strikes and counterattacks, their movements a blur of speed and power. Jorak moved in to assist, his cybernetic limbs enhancing his strength and agility, but Vrexall was a fierce opponent. He fought with the fury of a cornered predator, his strikes lethal and precise. But Dylan had learned to fight smarter, not harder. As Vrexall lunged for him again, Dylan sidestepped the attack and landed a disabling shot to the Thraxian's leg. Vrexall staggered, his speed faltering, and Dylan seized the opportunity. With a final, devastating blow, Dylan brought Vrexall to the ground. The Thraxian leader lay at Dylan's feet, gasping for breath, his body battered and broken. But even in defeat, Vrexall's eyes burned with hatred. "This isn't over," Vrexall hissed, his voice weak but defiant. "The Thraxians will never stop." Dylan stared down at him, his face calm but resolute. "Maybe not, but this is where you fall." With that, Dylan turned to Jorak, who had already begun disabling the flagship's command systems. Within minutes, the Thraxian fleet was in disarray, their coordinated assault falling apart as their leader was removed from the equation. The coalition forces pressed the advantage, pushing the Thraxians into full retreat. The battle was over. In the days that followed, the Thraxian dominion withdrew from Federation space, their defeat at Xinoa 5 a crippling blow to their ambitions. The Federation, though bloodied and battered, had held together. The coalition stood victorious, and Earth's place in the galaxy was secured. Dylan returned to the galactic capital, where the Council awarded him the highest honor they could bestow, a symbol of Earth's resilience, ingenuity, and strength. As he stood before the assembled delegates, the weight of everything he had endured settled on his shoulders. The gauntlet, the political maneuvering, the war, it had all led to this moment. But as he looked out at the crowd, he knew that this wasn't the end. The galaxy was still full of challenges, and Earth would continue to face threats from all sides. But they wouldn't face them alone. Dylan Cross, the weakest human, had become Earth's champion, and together, with their allies and the Federation, they would face whatever came next head-on.